Now in this video we're going to talk about Kartik's law of media bias, which is similar to Kartik's law of inflation, which you can study in more detail in this video up here in the upper right hand corner. So what is Kartik's law of media bias and what is the origin of that? For that we have to go into some background about how the media has evolved and evolved for the worse. We live in an age of internet advertising as the driver of media economics. And what that means is that the greater the engagement is, the more money the media companies make. And due to human nature, pessimism sells much more than optimism, because making you feel angry or frightened is what will get you to consume news media for longer. Now, this was not the case before the age of social media and internet news 24/7. Back when newspapers were delivered to your doorstep at 6 a.m. in the morning and your father would go get the newspaper, that's when the media had little to no incentive to make you feel bad, because if the newspaper was filled exclusively with pessimism and frightening news, that would not cause you to spend more on the newspaper. You would not buy more ads in the newspaper or anything like that. So there was no incentive to sell pessimism. Same with television news. In the United States, there was the 6 o'clock TV news and the 11 p.m. TV news, and it could only go on for half an hour, so it could not necessarily stretch the consumption of news to an infinite degree. Whether the news portrayed was optimistic or pessimistic, the advertising revenue they could get for ads played during the 6 p.m. news or the 11 p.m. news was not going to change that much. However, in the internet age, the possibility of infinite consumption arose, and for this reason, you have an incentive structure that is self-perpetuating through conveying more pessimism, and the job of the media is to make you angry or frightened. And I speak about that elsewhere on this channel. Anything that can scare people, especially scare the less informed people, is tremendously useful for the media. Whether it is fear about a pandemic, whether it is a fear about inflation, which is really not nearly as severe as anyone makes out to be, nor is inflation necessarily always bad, or a fear about artificial intelligence is going to take away your jobs. That we've been hearing about for decades, and it has not happened, for reasons I also explain on this channel. But pessimism sells, unfortunately, in an ad-driven, clickbait-driven media economy, and that is why you also have people spending 8 hours a day on news media and politics, to the extent that the media personalities are themselves the news itself. For example, this is May of 2024, one of the biggest news stories about how in the United States there's this so-called right-wing media outlet called the Daily Wire, but it's not really right-wing. It exists to convince right-wingers to drift into the left-wing position in a boil the frog manner. And one of the commentators there, Candace Owens, did not like how things were going there, or did not like the incentive structure of this because it was at odds with her values. And so the split between Candace Owens and the Daily Wire, run by Ben Shapiro, was itself a huge media story. Now, the media is about covering actual politicians and actual geopolitical events, not about covering drama between media personalities themselves. But this story itself probably consumed millions of hours of the general public's time, because this is what they're presented with as something interesting that's happening in the world, when it is in fact a story about the drama between individual media personalities. They should not be their own story. But you see how everything in the media is a derivative of a derivative of a derivative, and there's tremendous liberation in knowing what to ignore. None of these things are of particular importance at all. If you tuned out all news media other than what was happening in your immediate local community, you would do much better. And one saying that I always have is that your local police chief, mayor, and city council, wherever you live in any Western country, your local police chief, mayor, and city council has much more to do with the immediate well-being of your life and your own personal safety than the President of the United States. That's why it's strange when even in countries outside the United States, such as Australia or the UK, there are people addicted to politics and addicted to talking about US politics when they're not even in America. As I've pointed out before, my sister actually appears on Australian political TV to translate US political news for the Australian audience, And a lot of these Australians don't know who their local mayor is or who is on their local city governance board, but they know everything about what's happening in US presidential politics because that is what is produced into top flight television with good lighting and fancy studios. So that becomes a type of reality TV that they pay attention to. A lot of people who think they're too smart to get hyper emotional about professional sports somehow don't realize that they're not too smart for that because they're doing the same thing in terms of this reality TV packaged as being aware about politics. But back to the specific topic of this video, Kartik's law of media bias, my rule is a 4-to-1 discount ratio. Whenever you hear something optimistic in the mainstream news, take that at face value, it's probably true. Whenever you hear something negative and pessimistic, ignore 75% of it. About 1/4 of it is true. Now you don't have to worry about which 1/4 or whatever, but 1/4 of that is true. And then you'll get an accurate picture about what is happening in the world. So the positive news should be taken at face value as true. Of the negative news, randomly reject 75% of it. I'll give you another example. There was a news story recently about how Japan's inflation is at a 30-year high. And it was portrayed as negative. Oh, Japan's inflation briefly rose to 3%. That is terrible. Now, longtime viewers of this channel know that I believe 3% inflation is optimal, but not just that. Japan has been suffering from deflation for many decades. Getting out of deflation and into a low level of inflation is extremely positive. They have printed a huge amount of money. Relative to the size of their economy, they have printed 4 times as much money as the United States, and that's what it took to even get to 3% inflation, which even then only lasted for a short time. Now they're slipping back into very low inflation and deflation again, so they have to print more. But this was portrayed as a negative. Getting out of this terrible thing known as deflation is somehow bad because the entire news media has been trained to package anything inflation related as a scare meme because average people of limited intelligence have been trained to be terrified about inflation. So Kartik's law of media bias is this 4-to-1 ratio. Take all positive news in the modern age as true, take negative news as 75% false, and randomly reject 75% of it. Don't be too worried about which 75 you're rejecting and whether the accurate 25% is true. That will reveal itself in the due course of time. Now, if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.